In the United States, there are an estimated 400,000 children currently in the foster care system. At its core, foster care is a way to provide a temporary living solution for children whose biological parents can no longer care for them by living with relatives or volunteer families. The end goal has always been to find a permanent, stable home for these kids, either by taking care of them for long enough that their original home has now become safe, or by adopting them into a loving family. In theory, it sounds great, but in reality, the foster care system is riddled with so many issues that it often fails the vulnerable children it was designed to protect. It's not uncommon for children in foster care to be exposed to further violence or neglect, and it's sadly also common for the foster families that do provide adequate love and care to find it frustratingly difficult or even impossible to adopt a child that they're fostering. Today, we're going to investigate this sensitive and controversial topic, get to the bottom of exactly what has broken America's foster care system, and see if there's any possibility that it can be repaired. Before we get any deeper into the details, it's important to outline how the foster care system works in the first place. The first step is the discovery that a child's parents are unfit to continue being their legal guardians. This often happens through a call to the police or child protective services from people who are mandated to report signs of suspected abuse. These are people like teachers, doctors, and nurses. Once a complaint has been made, the Department of Social Services will investigate the home, and the child can be removed from their parents' custody if the investigations reveal evidence of neglect, abuse, repeated incarcerations, severe drug addiction, or anything else along these lines that would make the home immediately unsafe for children. A recent study found that of the estimated 600,000 children experiencing maltreatment in the US, 75% were experiencing neglect, 20% were physically abused, 9% were sexually abused, and 5% reported being severely emotionally abused. Considering that the sample pool of children who report being abused overlaps heavily with the sample of children in the foster system, these stats give us a pretty good indication that neglect is the primary reason for kids ending up in the foster system, and generally as a result of financial instability. After being removed from their parents, children are then taken into the custody of the state, who places them into one of three foster care options. The first is kinship care, where the kids are placed with relatives such as an aunt or uncle. The second option is non-kinship care, where the children are placed with families that have been certified by their state as vetted and trained to care for foster children. The third option is group care, which includes a special group homes or institutions, but this is generally reserved as a last resort scenario. The idea is that parents are given a probationary period, usually around 2 years, where they can straighten out their situation to regain custody of their children. For instance, in the case of addiction, this would involve regular meetings with a counselor and passing numerous drug tests. However, if enough time has passed, the state will then press to completely revoke parental rights and push for the child to be permanently adopted elsewhere. Every year, around 225,000 children exit the foster care system. Around half of these are reunited with their parents, about 40% are adopted, and the remaining 10% are what's known as emancipated, as they turn 18 and are aged out of the system without ever having found a stable living situation. Now, it must be said that examining the direct effects of the foster care system on a person's long-term well-being is difficult, because it can't be determined for sure if the outcomes are a result of the fostering itself or from the abuse previously suffered. These are confounding variables that are difficult to separate, but they still are statistically significant. For some reference, 25% of all children in the US report being abused or neglected at some point in their youth, while only 0.3% of children end up in the foster system. If the effects we are about to discuss were only due to abuse or neglect, we would expect to see them represented in similar rates across these other groups that experienced abuse, but we don't, indicating that the experience of being in foster care itself has something to do with these outcomes. First, we'll cover the rates of homelessness. Between ages 17 and 19, 1 in 5 former foster care children report being homeless for some period of time, a figure that rises to 1 in 4 between the ages of 19 and 21. Most shockingly, a recent study found that between 31 and 49% of former foster children will experience homelessness at some point before the age of 26. Not only is this rate of homelessness far higher than the average for this age range, but even the time spent homeless is longer than that experienced by their non-foster peers, 27.5 months compared to 19.3 months on average. Also alarming are the rates of incarcerations, arrests, and overall run-ins with the law. By age 17, 50% of all foster youth will have had an encounter with the juvenile legal system, either through detention, arrest, or conviction. One study showed that by age 26, 70% of former foster youth will have been arrested at least once, creating what researchers are dubbing the foster care to prison pipeline. And these stats don't even touch on the similarly high rates that end up developing addictions to drugs or alcohol, divorce, having their own kids enter the foster care system, and so on. But raw statistics aren't all that helpful on their own. Let's now dive into exactly what it is about foster care that could be causing these detrimental outcomes. One of the most obvious ways the system negatively affects children is through the innately traumatic experience of being forcibly removed from one's parents. It's already well documented that the separation from parents at a young age is associated with higher levels of anxiety, depression, and the formation of attachment disorders, with a study from the University of Baltimore describing it as long-term emotional and psychological consequences. What's interesting is that this effect is still significant even if the parents they are being removed from are abusive. There's something very psychologically important about the bond between child and parent, and even if the relationship is unhealthy or dangerous, breaking that bond has lasting impacts. Clearly, this doesn't mean it's healthier for a child to remain in a highly abusive home simply to avoid this psychological side effect, but it is something that needs to be kept in mind as it will affect nearly every foster youth. But a big problem with the foster system is that this separation from parents doesn't always happen just once. For many children, over the years, they end up being passed around many times, and higher risks of all the previously discussed issues are associated with those who change homes more than 5 times. This is a part of foster care that's very difficult to avoid, and for a few reasons. Firstly, because the primary goal of the foster system is to reunite children with their parents, oftentimes they are pulled out for a few months and return to their homes when situations improve. However, if, for instance, a parent relapses with a drug addiction, the child can be removed again, initiating the whole process from scratch. However, even if the biological parents are largely out of the picture, children can be moved between foster families themselves when one family moves, stops fostering, or if the child is really disruptive and the family requests that they be sent somewhere else that can more appropriately handle them. Another problem occurs with emergency placements. One foster family may be prepared to take in a child for only a short period, for example. They may be called to pick up a child whose parents were arrested at 3 in the morning. However, the family isn't financially prepared to permanently care for this child, so after a few days, they're relocated once again to a different family that's better suited for the long term, but just wasn't available for the first pickup situation. All of this moving and instability has a serious effect on a child's worldview, making it so understandable why so many of them report feeling being unloved, unwanted, or simply not belonging, and why so many foster children attempt to run away from foster families even when the living situation is safe. But unfortunately, even with families vetted and trained by the state, the living situation isn't always safe, resulting in the most tragic possibility of the entire system, that being abusive foster families. For a variety of reasons, becoming a foster family is a tempting option for those who wish to do harm to children. Perhaps what attracts them is the access to someone else's kids, or perhaps it's the fact that because many of the children have already been abused, they might be less likely to report further problems. Whatever the reasoning is, not every foster family has the child's best interest in mind. A 2013 study found that 21% of foster youth experienced abuse or neglect in a foster home. And a study from the University of San Diego School of Law found that there are 400,000 foster abuse cases reported every single year in the US. One of the most shocking examples of foster abuse occurred very recently in the aftermath of the arrests of the Turpin parents. If you've never heard of the Turpin case, be advised that this contains details of horrific abuse. The Turpins had 13 children, and in 2018, one of them escaped their home and phoned the police, telling the dispatcher that the parents had been torturing them for years, that they were chained to beds, and that the stench in the house was so bad that they could barely breathe. The house was raided, and the police found dead pets, moldy food, and most surfaces covered in trash as human excrement. The children were only allowed to bathe once a year and were caked in dirt, shackled to beds for weeks on end, and the oldest victim, a 29-year-old woman, was so malnourished that she weighed just 82 pounds, or 37 kilograms. Fortunately, with the overwhelming evidence at hand, the Turpins were shown no mercy in court and both were sentenced to life in prison. However, we now arrive at today's subject. With no parents, many of the young children were placed in the foster care system, and specifically 5 of the youngest were placed in a single home together, where they were immediately subject to further abuse. Allegations against the foster family included hitting them in the face with sandals, pulling their hair, hitting them with a belt, and striking their heads. And allegations against the father specifically included grabbing, fondling, and kissing them on the mouth. The kids were allegedly forced to eat until they were so full they would throw up, and then they would be forced fed their own vomit. But perhaps worst of all, the couple repeatedly told the kids that they were worthless, that they should kill themselves, and that their biological parents only mistreated them because they were unlovable. The couple was arrested and charged with multiple counts of abuse, alongside their 37-year-old daughter, who was charged with witness intimidation. The situation isn't only tragic, but outright enraging. The system designed to protect children was trusted with victims of some of the most horrific abuse imaginable, and only subjected them to further horror. Yeah, it's true that you can't foresee every possible threat. People can deceive state officials, but given the circumstances, you would expect that the foster family to care for the Turpin children would have been among the most vetted and carefully selected in history. But they weren't. The Turpin kids have recently initiated a lawsuit against the agencies involved with their placement, and their lawyer summed up their situation nicely when he said, "I used to be the head of the sexual assault unit and child molester unit in Riverside County, so I've seen the worst of the worst, and to be honest with you, I've seen worse than what happened at the Turpin home, but I've never in my wildest dreams seen what happened to them once, and then a county and law enforcement get involved and then put them back in the same kind of place for a second time." Taking things down a notch, there are also many foster families across that do not have evil intent toward the children in their care, but simply aren't well trained in how to handle their unique situations. This is a very commonly reported sentiment, one that was echoed by a former foster youth we interviewed for this video, who said, "I was in 8 homes for about 6 years between the ages of 12 and 18. I would say I felt safe in all the homes. I was miserable, but I wasn't unsafe. The biggest challenge I had was feeling like my opinions or feelings mattered. I had a bed and food, but that was really it." On the flip side, the other major problem with the foster care system is how hard it can make the process for the genuine foster families to adopt the kids they love and care for. Because the primary goal is reunification, children aren't eligible to be adopted until they've been in the system for a certain amount of time, which can depend on the state. And unfortunately, even once this time is up, various government agencies can continue complicating the adoption process, dragging their feet to revoke parental rights from the biological parents. Another common thing that happens is that the time to adopt clock can be reset each time when the child reunites with their parents, despite the fact that they are continually removed from them when the situation deteriorates once again. When we asked about these frustrations with the system, one foster parent from Idaho said, "My biggest problem is that I feel that the state drags things out for so long that it makes it impossible for foster parents to adopt in a time frame that's good for kids. For a case to go on for 2 years, that's 2 years lost on that child's life. In a child's early life, that's catastrophic." Even if the timing might work out well, because adoption in the United States is such a difficult and expensive process already, many families still opt to avoid it because they simply can't afford it. Or even if they would be able to afford to adopt just one child, they don't want to because they are currently fostering several siblings, and because they can't afford to adopt all of them, don't want to split up a family. One more problem is that, depending on the state, foster families receive different stipends to help pay for the needs of the children. The amount of aid sent to families can't be too high, or it would encourage those with ill intent to get into the system just for money, but it does need to be enough to cover basic needs. And in many states, it's considered insufficient. For example, in Alabama, foster families are given around just $500 a month, which in today's day and age is worth less and less every year. Many of the frustrations here are only the fault of the foster system, but of several government agencies combined, which makes addressing the problem all the more complicated. For instance, if you're fostering a young boy and he needs to go to the doctor, it's often not as simple as taking him to your usual general practitioner. At a very basic level, you need to be in contact with agency representatives to understand where his visit will be covered by insurance. You'll need permission to view his medical history, along with much more. And a common complaint from foster parents is that critical information like this isn't always made readily available. Looking at the bigger picture, we can see that addressing the problems of the foster care requires addressing problems in several places simultaneously, which is all much easier said than done. But one area that could be addressed directly would be the improvement of TAL, or transition to adulthood living. As we said earlier, former foster youth face incredibly high rates of incarceration and homelessness, and much of this is a result of turning 18 and essentially being tossed out into the adult world with little direction and next to no support. But these rates are especially bad for those who turn 18 without ever having been adopted, or who were adopted in their late teenage years. TAL exists to aid these specific cases, but despite its existence and the many scholarships and career advice they offer, only 3% of foster youth that age out of the system will ever graduate from college. Adding funding to or improving this system could better help these individuals realize the opportunities available to them after leaving foster care and help guide them into a more stable life path. Of course, this is difficult because once they're 18, they are legally an adult and get to make all these choices for themselves, but increasing awareness of these opportunities and public services could help them navigate the overwhelming and tumultuous years of early adulthood, which could be hard enough on their own for the average youth, let alone those who may have gone years without a stable home or parents. But for as much as the foster system falls flat, it really just is the best we currently have. Without that and the numerous volunteer families that sacrifice their time, money, and emotions, hundreds of thousands of children every year would have nowhere else to turn. And while there are plenty of horror stories, there are many cases of successful reunification with parents, happy adoptions, and even successful former foster children that aged out of the system and forged their own path in life. However, this doesn't mean we can ignore its flaws, which ultimately need to be addressed, not just for the immediate well-being of children at one of the most vulnerable and dangerous times in their lives, but also to set the path of their happiness and success long after they've graduated from the foster care system.